Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of the Senator's time and everyone's. So welcome to the NCDA webinar, the CARES Act overview with Senator Thom Tillis. My name is Emily Martin. I'm NCDA's program manager, and we're excited to have you with us. Before getting started, we want to overview the logistics of this webinar platform. All attendees are muted. Please remember to keep yourself muted the entire presentation so we don't have any interruptions. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can type your question into the questions box at any time during the presentation. To access this option, click Questions from the expanded menu on the right side of your screen, noting that you may need to click the orange box with a white arrow to expand the menu. These questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. If we run short on time and are not able to answer all of the questions, we will work with our presenters to get answers for you, and we'll send these out via email following the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants to use as a resource. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce NCDA President Dr. Patricia Mitchell, who will offer welcoming remarks and introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, our second virtual offering in just 7 days. I would like to say a special thank you at this time to partnership with North Carolina, EDPNC, and particularly John Loyak and Guy Gaster, who are partnering with us on this webinar today and have been very instrumental in helping arrange it. These webinars are designed to help North Carolina economic developers execute their growing and changing leadership responsibilities in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic consequences. In a moment, I'll introduce today's guest, U.S. Senator Thom Tillis. But first, I'd like to thank NCEDA's annual sponsors for their continued generosity. Their support is vital to our professional development mission. These include our Longleaf Pine sponsor, Alliance Consulting Engineers, our Dogwood sponsor, Stewart, our patron sponsors, Brand Acceleration, DMJ and Company, Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, Electric Cities of North Carolina, Energy United, Greenfield, Monroe Union County Economic Development, Nexen Pruitt, Norfolk Southern, the North Carolina Community College System, North Carolina Electric Co-ops, North Carolina Railroad Company, North Carolina Southeast, Samet Corporation, and Smith Anderson. Our media partner, WRAL TechWire, and our annual partners, the North Carolina Department of Commerce and the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina, and again, our partner for today. We appreciate their generous support of NCEDA. On Sunday, March 8th, public health officials reported North Carolina's first case of COVID-19. The weeks since have witnessed dramatic, unanticipated losses to our state's economy, including more than 500,000 unemployment insurance claims and thousands of idle businesses. Congress responded with passage of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, known as CARES. The package includes support for businesses, nonprofit organizations, healthcare facilities, and dislocated workers. Though the CARES Act is likely not the last piece of legislation we'll see coming from Washington in the wake of COVID-19, it certainly is one that economic development professionals are looking closely at right now. Here to tell us more about its provisions is U.S. Senator Thom Tillis. Senator Tillis was elected to his current office in November of 2014. His committee assignments include the Judiciary, Armed Services, Banking, and Veterans Affairs. He started his political career as a PTA president at his daughter's high school. That led to a seat on the Board of Commissioners at the town of Cornelius. In 2006, he was elected to the North Carolina House of Representatives and just 5 years later became Speaker of the House. It was from that position that he led the state through a series of fundamental reforms to its economic, fiscal, and business climate policies. Senator Tillis's professional background also includes management positions at IBM Corporation and PricewaterhouseCoopers. We're very grateful the senator could join us today. He'll speak for a few minutes, after which Chris Platte, co-chairman of NCEDA's Legislative Committee, will facilitate a Q&A session. It is now my pleasure to turn over the virtual podium to U.S. Senator Thom Tillis. Welcome, Senator, and thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody being on the call, and like I've said on similar forums over the past couple of weeks, we hope this is really the beginning of a dialogue as we continue to figure out what response the federal government, working with the state and local governments, need to do, both for the physical health, but also the economic stability of North Carolina and the nation. The thing that we're working most on now is mobilizing not only the $350 billion that was in the payroll protection program, but the individual assistance, Main Street lending, transportation dollars, all of the other resources that were passed in the CARES Act, totaling about $2.2 trillion. You're seeing now, we're getting increased reports of individuals getting their stabilization checks, the $1,200 per adult, $500 per dependent child. Several million have already been posted into bank accounts, and we expect tens of millions by the end of the week. About half, 80 million to 90 million, will go through electronic deposit because the IRS or Social Security Administration has that relationship already with the beneficiaries. Unfortunately, about another half will have to go out by check, and that could take weeks. It could take over a month before we'll see the majority of those economic assistance checks going out. At the same time, we've seen the payroll protection program be very popular. It's certainly had its challenges as you take a product that didn't exist a month ago and mobilize the banking industry to be on the front lines underwriting the loans. I'm disappointed to report that today may be the day where $350 billion is allocated, and we're working with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to try, through unanimous consent, get another $250 billion in there. And quite honestly, I think that we may have to go back for another tranche after that, but we're working on it. Now, on the, so I do believe, I do have some questions that were submitted I'll touch on, but I'd really prefer to go to any other questions that we may have in the time provided. Any questions we don't get to over the call, we'll certainly follow up. My staff, Kyle Sanders, who's my Deputy Chief of Staff, is on the call, and his primary focus is economic development. So we'll continue to answer your questions and do the blocking and tackling. Since we passed the CARES Act that granted broad authority for the administration to create guidelines and the rules of the road for executing the program, we have been in constant communication with Treasury, the financial regulators, to overcome barriers that we've seen. We still have some constraints on eligibility. There are some nonprofits, for example, that will require congressional action to provide support. Think YMCA and other organizations. We've got to work on that. We have been successful with removing some of the obstacles. One, you may have remembered, it was broadly reported that Wells Fargo had reached an asset cap and were no longer to underwrite loans. Working with the Fed, we were able to remove those barriers with the number of people with banking relationships with Wells Fargo across the country, and certainly in North Carolina, that was a barrier we had to overcome quickly. Now the loans have been underwritten, the SBA is approving them, but the majority is still not flowing out yet. And we've got a lot of things that we've got to work on. One that I'm hearing consistently is the covered period, the 8 weeks. The reality is the 8-week period of time may be appropriate. When the clock starts ticking is something that we've come to realize we need to try and get consensus in Congress to change. There are going to be some businesses that are going to lag behind the beginning of the recovery. So we need to think more in terms of when is it realistic that these resources, that if you use them for payroll or a grant and a forgivable loan, what should the timing be? And that's going to take some work, and it is going to take additional action by Congress, something we're working on. I think another question that was asked relates to if you're not getting the support you need from your bank, should you look for other options? I would say you should look at every option to get a loan application in. I will say, however, that until we get, if you don't already have an application in and you've been told that you've been approved, then you should almost certainly get the resources. But as we approach that $350 billion cap, banks will most likely not take applications until they get certainty from the federal government that the additional resources are in there. We should have more information on that as the day progresses, literally today, and we'll share it as quickly as we can get it. I think in terms of the questions, most of the ones that I see from the ones that were submitted initially, I've tried to cover in my comments, but with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or move on to anyone else who's in line to present.
Good morning, Senator Tillis.
Hi, Chris.
Thank you so much for providing some time out of your schedule today to talk about the CARES Act. For everyone joining us, my name is Chris Polte, and I'm the Executive Director of Monroe Union County Economic Development and a member of NCEDA's Board of Directors and co-chair of the Legislative Committee. As Emily said, due to the time constraints, we'll try to get as many answers, as many questions answered as possible, but we will have a follow-up of this webinar with some other answers for you. Well, I know that we want to get started, so the first question I have for you, sir, will there be a phase 4, and what will that potentially include?
Yeah, I think there will be. I hesitate to call it phase 4 because I don't want to set the expectation that it could be something fiscally of the scale of phase 3, the CARES Act, which was $2.2 trillion. I do think that there has to be follow-on legislation, some of that would expand the eligibility of the program to entities that are not currently eligible. This is what I said in my opening comments. Maybe being a little bit more precise about when the 8-week period would kick in for businesses that are likely to lag. There may be some other programs or reprogramming actually in the CARES Act as we see some of the intended programs getting a high take rate like the payroll protection program, and other ones, Main Street lending, other provisions in the bill, we will need to adjust and see where the money is best spent. I should also mention that there are provisions that are also being mobilized. You may have seen an announcement this week that North Carolina got over $250 million for airport improvement projects. That came from DOT. It was authorized, the acceleration was authorized under the CARES Act, but there are those programs that we need to go back, look at, and possibly repurpose. But we will almost certainly do that. Right now, we're slated to go into session the first week of May, if we are reaching the peak of the curve, particularly in Washington, D.C., then I, for one, hope that we can get back so that we can move measures that may not have unanimous support, but sufficient support from Republicans and Democrats to move to the president's desk.
Great. Well, thank you. We hear mostly about the crisis in terms of its challenges, but what potential economic opportunities do you anticipate coming for our state?
Well, we had a call yesterday with some economic developers in the eastern part of the state, and I think a very important point was made. We've learned a very valuable lesson with this crisis response, and the globalization, global supply chains we've gotten a lot of benefits in terms of reducing prices and increasing scale, but we also identified some serious challenges when you have a pandemic or a global crisis like we're having right now. So I think if you think about North Carolina and you think about our textile sector, which is really retooled to generate or to create protective equipment, masks, gowns.
Right.
If you take a look at our pharmaceutical industry, which like the rest of the world, literally has relied so much on China for manufacturing of so many drugs, so many therapeutics that will most likely be mobilizing for the next wave of COVID. We'll see it reemerge again, I believe, in November. But by then, we'll have a comprehensive list of therapeutics, a number of other medications, and many of those are still heavily reliant on China. So I think if you look at our biotech sector, our pharmaceutical sector, our textile sectors, some of these other businesses that are manufacturing medical devices, we need to work very quickly to showcase North Carolina as the home for some portion of that manufacturing capability that will almost certainly move out of China. The question is, does it move to the United States or some other jurisdiction where we feel more comfortable with having them a part of our supply chains here? But I absolutely believe this represents an opportunity for us. What we need to be doing now, number one, we've got to fight the crisis and get the economy reopened, but in lockstep, we need to be thinking about these strategic sectors. And we need to be thinking about the pitch that we would have as the home to a certain amount of that capability that I think almost certainly will come back into the United States. Not all of it, because I don't think that would be appropriate, but enough to where we have the scale to mobilize more quickly than we did with this pandemic.
Excellent. Well, I know that you have a lot of information coming into your office, but what is the best advice that you'd give North Carolina economic development leaders on how to communicate with Congress about their community's needs?
Well, I think one thing that we have to really focus on collectively is what a reasonable, safe startup looks like for non-essential businesses, and the timing of that. I think that we all, in order for us to develop beyond the baseline economy that was extraordinary back in February and early March, is we need to think about a consensus way to go about reopening business. And that's going to start with implementing more stringent measures for the essential businesses that are open today. Quite honestly, we've got to prove the ability to run the business and to open the economy safely. Let's start with making sure that we have best practices in the essential businesses that are open today. And then we're going to need the help of everyone to communicate how important it is going to be over the course of the summer, even after we get past the peak of the curve, for us to behave differently so that we can safely scale back up and not risk the reemergence of another peak as we go into the summer. We will almost certainly in our population for some time to come. The question is managing it to levels to where healthcare and our economy, healthcare system is not overburdened and our economy is not distracted and impacted by it. So I think it's, on one front, we need to think about how seriously we need to take the governor's orders. I think the governor's done a very good job under the circumstances, the administration's orders and local government orders, and really do our part to communicate how important it is for individuals to comply, because it's being driven by data. People get frustrated because the orders change, but they're changing because we're getting more information and we're finding better. It's like a response to a hurricane, or it's like a responses in a battle plan. New data comes in, threats that are mitigated, figure out how to duplicate and replicate those kinds of policies. Policies that you thought would work that aren't working, you change them and move on. So we need all of our business community and economic developers to play a part in trying to come up with a safe baseline for reopening, and then very aggressively move to how do we better prepare for it and seize the opportunity, I think, for economic development in the process.
Excellent. Well, I think one of the things that's always been important to us is the need for broadband, particularly in our rural and underserved communities. Is there any unique opportunities here with this that we can finally fix some of that problem with rural North Carolina's broadband?
Well, I think that this epidemic or this pandemic has certainly demonstrated the need for connectivity. Just take a look at what we're doing today and think about areas of our state where it may not be possible for somebody to participate in these sorts of forums. I think that I believe that the business sector is looking at this and looking at the business opportunity for providing more broadband capability in more places. I personally, along with Senator Burr, have been working with the cellular companies and with a subsidiary of SpaceX, which is launching a constellation of satellites that can provide low-cost, ubiquitous 5G type high-speed broadband to rural areas. Think HughesNet several generations past. And these are things that I think we will be able to accelerate. I think that the federal government will start making more investments in broadband infrastructure. And I think I had a meeting with the county commissioners in my office about a month and a half ago, and we're working with the state to really try and clear one of the challenges that you have with providing broadband to more places is the patchwork of regulation. So if I'm a business and I'm looking at any state, say North Carolina, with 550 towns, 100 counties, a state government, and different ways that you enter at those local governmental units, if we could come up with a consistent method of engagement for the telecommunications companies, for the satellite providers, so that we become a state that provides more certainty. They know if they make an investment here, they don't have to interact with over 600 different governmental entities, depending upon where they are in the state. Then I think that we can make North Carolina a real test bed for accelerating broadband. That's the discussion we had with the subsidiary of SpaceX. And they were actually appreciative of the fact that we initiated the discussion. Governor Cooper's administration has gotten involved. So what we're trying to communicate to the county commissions is let's look at a statewide best practice for regulatory engagement, and then have counties adopt it so that when a business looks at expanding broadband in North Carolina, they'll look at this state very differently from other states that haven't done it. At the time that I met with the telco providers, they said that was the first meeting of its kind, and they appreciated the fact that we would take the initiative to do it. Those are the sorts of things that will accelerate broadband connectivity. If you add to that state and federal funding to work in areas that are unserved or underserved, then I think that we can really accelerate broadband access, and not just through the traditional concept of planting fiber in the ground and getting it out to the household. There are so many other ways to do it now, and there will be so many more over the next 3 to 5 years. We need to skate where that puck is going to be, not where the puck is today.
Very good point. Thank you. Obviously some of the sectors are getting hit harder than others, such as hospitality, and they'll probably lag in their recovery. Is there any other discussions about trying to help those jobs for those folks? Yes,
Chris, that's exactly why I made the comment about our focus on the covered period. The 8-week period may be okay. It could be a little bit more. We can have that discussion, but I do think that for industries, if you take a look at the restaurant industry and the hospitality industries, they are going to lag behind other businesses that as soon as we allow them to go back to work, they'll go back to work. And so their covered period over the next 8 weeks or over the next 12 weeks, depending upon when they get their loan, is probably appropriate. But we've got to go back and now finally tune some of the provisions in the CARES Act so that restaurants may actually come on a little bit sooner than hospitality or hotels and conventions. But then we have to take a look at these sector specific reemergences and then tune the CARES Act and any other provisions that we would pass in a follow-on bill to the reality of how sectors and subsectors are going to restart their businesses.
Mm-hmm. Great. One of the things that was in the bill was $250 million for our airports in North Carolina. Do you have any specifics on that, what that may include or help with?
Yeah, we actually put out a press report. I had a conference call with Secretary Chow this week, and about 100 and I'm working off of memory, so don't hold me to the decimal point, but about I think about 136 million will be going to Charlotte for their airport improvement project. A little under 50 million, I think it's 49.6 million, will be going to RDU, and then another 100 million to airport improvement projects across the state, roughly that. So that's one tranche. There's another tranche that we're not at liberty yet. I actually do not have the details, but I know federal transit dollars will also come to the state, and we'll be making that announcement in the coming days. That was what I was referring to. There were other, we talk about the payroll protection program. That was $350 billion of a $2.2 trillion package. Now we're seeing some of the other money flowing from other programs that were authorized under the CARES Act, the transportation projects being the first significant ones beyond payroll protection program, and the individual assistance that are really beginning to mobilize now. And those will have a good I think they'll have a good stimulative effect on our economy.
Very good, thank you. Looking at some of the, I guess in the rural communities, particularly in the tourism area, they were hit through their winter with the, Transylvania County and other counties that really depend on that winter tourism. Now the summer tourism, maybe some lag there. How would you recommend some advice for those guys in those communities?
Well, we've got a lot of things to work on there. We have obviously the impact from the COVID response and delayed starts for any sort of tourism or travel flow. But when we reopen, we're going to have the problem of labor. I mean, it seems counterintuitive when you have over 500,000 people applying for unemployment, but many of them were not employed in the hospitality sector where you have seasonal labor and you have H-2B workers and other people that need to flow in. The way the H-2B program works, the seasonal workers, which is the lifeblood of a lot of our tourists, think hotels and think even fairs and state fairs and county fairs, if they get the go-ahead to start operations later in the summer, they're going to be at a loss for starting because of labor. So we're taking a look at the H-2B program. The way that you normally do this, you have seasonal applications for workers. Many of them, you would not be taking it in the first half of the year because you're not able to open up. Now we've got to figure out how we can repurpose those programs to make sure that the labor is there if these businesses are able to reopen and take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Plan or some of the other lending devices in the CARES Act. Or I should say, we should also not forget other Small Business Administration loan vehicles that are still out there and available to businesses. So that's something, as a part of our restart, we've got to start looking at these sectors and say, this is when they're likely to come online. What impediments are they going to run into, whether it's just baseline cash flow, whether it is labor, and we've got to start having that restart plan, which are the mechanics of getting the businesses back online after the government orders have been relieved or at least relaxed at some level.
This one may be a little bit of a loaded question, so I apologize, but the relationship with China right now, being that our supply chain is attached so much to them, and you had already mentioned some of that coming back into the U.S. Do you foresee, how do you look at that relationship going forward?
Well, frankly, I've had a problem with China long before the pandemic, and I viewed China through three very different lenses in my roles on committees: through Senate Armed Services, through Judiciary, Intellectual Property Theft. I chair the Intellectual Property Subcommittee in Judiciary, and in banking. And quite honestly, they were a bad actor economically before they became a bad actor in terms of the way they responded to the COVID crisis and sharing information that I firmly believe could have given us a month or more time to respond to it. And so we've got to look at them through every single lens. Their military ventures are troubling to me as a member of Senate Armed Services. Their intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers are problematic. And then the now very well understood reliance in terms of our global supply chain are all things that we have to put on the table. And I expect China to be a major focus of congressional actions when we get back. First, we've got to hold them accountable for the way they behaved with the COVID response. But secondly, we've got to look at where we had unacceptable vulnerabilities because of our reliance on China, and we have to retool. Some of that will be probably onshoring some of the offshore capacity that we have with China right now. Some of it may be diversifying into other countries where we have normalized and more trusting relationships. And some of those could actually be countries in the Pacific Rim, but they could be across the globe. Those are all things we're going to have to look at systematically because we can't, if you think about it now, if you just think about China and their military and economic aspirations, they've made no secret that they want to be the world superpower militarily and economically over the next couple of decades. And our investment in China right now is aiding and abetting their strategy to do that. We need to take that seriously, and we need to take a look. There may be some economic consequences if we find that bringing back some of the manufacturing capacity to the United States creates a cost, but that cost is justified because of national security and health concerns. We have to figure out what role the federal and state governments are going to have to play in that.
Great. I appreciate you answering that. There's going to be, is there any consideration for local governments, both municipal and county? Obviously with sales tax reductions and other things, the revenue streams coming into our communities are hit pretty hard. So is there anything that may be coming to help with that?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to, a part of the follow-on to the CARES Act that I think we have to look at is where there's a nexus between the actions the federal and state government took to try and fight the virus and costs that were incurred by state and local governments as part of their response, and come up with some sort of a granting mechanism where if the costs are well documented, that we have to have some way to take some of the edge off. I don't know that we'll have the resources to make everybody whole, but to take some of the edge off. You can see that, incidentally, I worry a lot about rural hospitals and rural health systems. They were already stressed before we ordered them not to do elective surgeries. My daughter's a nurse at a hospital here in Charlotte, and they're actually closing some floors that were largely dedicated to elective surgery and rolling some of the healthcare workers off and allowing them to opt out of coming in on shifts, because that entire revenue stream has gone away and will go away until we feel like we've got the capacity to allow elective surgeries, elective procedures, and still have the surge capacity that we may need until we get to the peak of the curve. All of those are economic consequences that resulted from actions that we had to take to contain the virus. So we have to come up with some fair mechanism for reimbursing and providing some revenue to those who were impacted. So it's not only county and city governments, but probably also some of the private sectors who have really stepped up, done their part to help us with the virus, and now we have to do our part to help them with the economic consequences of the COVID response.
Yeah, it's amazing how people have stepped up and had to shift, their profit stream for sure.
It has been extraordinary, and I tell you, the pharmaceutical industry, I know many people criticize the pharmaceutical industry. It has been an easy target for many people, but right now you're seeing exactly the innovative capability of that industry, in the United States likely being the jurisdiction that has the lion's share of the therapeutics and the vaccines that the rest of the world will take advantage of. And they have stepped up. And if you take a look at our testing labs and some of the innovation there with the instant test or near instant test that we're having for COVID and them ramping up capacity, there are a lot of extraordinary things that have happened. And to the extent that any entity can say we did this because we thought we needed to do our part, then we also need to figure out a fair way to provide resources when it's appropriate.
That's exactly right. Thank you. Looking at things like nonprofits in the U.S., the 501c6s that exist, particularly like a YMCA, how does that fit into the CARES Act?
Well, that's why I mentioned the YMCA in my opening comments. Right now, they're not eligible for the program, and they're probably having more demand and doing more than they would do in normal times. So that is something that will require congressional action and something that I support. We originally tried to push the administration, but to see if they could do it within their current authorities. They can't, and that would be something, quite honestly, I would hope that we could check our ideological priorities at the door and just all agree that these organizations need some support and try to get that done even before we get back into Congress in early May.
Well, I believe we've probably ended our time limit here with you, and I cannot thank you enough for your gracious time with us today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And please keep in mind my chief of staff and head on economic development, Kyle Sanders. He's worked hard to try and build relationships across the state with economic development organizations. And we stand ready to help you right now in dealing with the COVID response, but also with any opportunity for economic development in North Carolina. That's his primary job, and he's good at it. And I want to make sure that everybody in the economic development world knows that he stands ready to help.
Yeah, thank you. Your staff has always been gracious for us here in Union County too, so thank you. To our webinar participants, thank you so much for your questions and patience as we find ways to provide content virtually. Also, we want to thank our NCEDA annual sponsors for their support, and the Professional Development Committee is currently working to build a webinar series, so be on the lookout for news of that and other future virtual offerings by the organization. So in the meantime, please stay connected, stay engaged, and stay safe. Have a great day. Thank you, guys.